Well, we've come to the end of our study of the life of David. And we've covered a lot of ground. You know, his story takes up about 60 chapters in the Bible, making his life one of the most sustained portions of Scripture in all the biographies that we can look at. We might know more about David's life than any other person except for Jesus, maybe Paul. But we have a pretty complete biography, picking up with David as a young man in chapter 16, and then watching him in his triumph over Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And we come into 1 Kings and 1 Chronicles, and we see his death. It's an unusual way to start a book, with a death. You know, the book of Genesis starts with creation. Book of Exodus begins with the life of Moses. Death usually comes at the end, like we read about Moses' death at the end of Deuteronomy. But we start 1 Kings with the death of David, and of course the rise of his son Solomon. And you really can't separate those two things. If you have your Bibles, I'm going to ask you to turn over to 1 Kings chapter 1, where we begin reading with verse 1. Now King David was old and advanced in years, and although they covered him with clothes, he could not get warm. Went to my first baseball game of the year last night. Left the house about 4 o'clock. It was about 70 degrees. By 6 p.m., it was 20 degrees below zero. I didn't bring a coat. I don't know if y'all have noticed, I shake a little bit always. When it gets cold, I really start to vibrate. So I just about beat myself up on those cold bleachers last night. The game lasted 2.5 hours, and after the 7th inning was finally over, I was packing my stuff to go, and the coach came up to the fence and told the parents, "Give us about 15 minutes and we'll get the second game started as soon as we can." I looked at Julie, I said, "There's another game?" She said, "I didn't know." So I'm just lucky to be here. This verse has a new perspective for me. But you look at David and his life, and you know, it's sad to see him in this condition. He, an old man, infirm, who can't get warm. Now, the solution his court comes up with in the next few verses, I won't get into the details of it because it's a little uncomfortable. They get a young woman to keep him warm, but you see him at the end of his years here in pretty bad shape, physically speaking. A lot of people look at this and think of him as senile, perhaps, but in what we're going to see, it seems like the light of his intelligence lasted all the way through his final days, because most of what we're going to talk about tonight is going to be David's parting words to Solomon, his wisdom that he leaves with the next king, his son. But before we get into that, we have to deal with another rival to the throne. Anytime there's transition in a monarchy, there's a rivalry, especially with a man like David who had so many children. And many of his sons had died, but there was still one older than Solomon who was a rival to the throne. His name was Adonijah. And before David died, he was positioning himself to be the next king. And his behavior and appearance suggests that perhaps Israel was facing another Absalom. Look at 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 5, and see if this sounds like what we studied about Absalom several weeks ago. He prepared for himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. Verse 6 says he was a very handsome man. Well, that sounds a lot like Absalom, and I think it's intentional that the writer is giving us some details that echo Absalom's rebellion. This is trouble for Israel. If Adonijah comes, he is not the one that God wants on the throne. Now, he made several convincing claims. Verse 6, he was born next after Absalom, meaning he was David's oldest living son. The fourth, we read about the demise of Amnon, of Absalom. We don't know what happened to his second-born son. Probably by this time he's dead. Another thing is that some very influential people were backing Adonijah. One was the priest Abiathar, who helped David out a lot when he was running from Saul. He'd been with David for a long time, and he was one of two priests in Israel at this time alongside Zadok, very powerful ally to Adonijah. And then Joab. We've learned a lot about Joab. Joab was David's general, his army commander, his right-hand man. He was siding with Adonijah over Solomon, which another very influential leader. Moreover, David had never at any time questioned Adonijah's actions. Verse 6 says, his father had never at any time displeased him by asking, why have you done thus and so? But that may be because David wasn't really aware that Adonijah was positioning himself this way. If you go on down to verse 11, Nathan says to Bathsheba, have you not heard that Adonijah, the son of Haggith, has become king, and David our Lord does not know it? So he's saying he's king now. David doesn't even know about this. I'm not sure David was in the know here, and that may be why he hadn't said anything to Adonijah about it. Notwithstanding all these things in Adonijah's favor, his claims were illegitimate. God had already named Solomon to be David's successor, and that much is said through David in 1 Chronicles 22, verses 9 and 10. We won't take the time to go over and read that. But David makes that clear in this chapter, 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 13, where Nathan instructs Bathsheba, go in and say, did not my lord the king swear to your servant, saying, Solomon your son shall reign after me? And again, this is repeated in verse 19. Apparently, David had said, the Lord told me it's Solomon, and he told Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, this was so. And it's unquestionable who should be on the throne. Now, Adonijah had some powerful people on his side, but Solomon did as well. If you look at verse 8, he had Zadok the priest. He had Benaiah. Do you remember Benaiah, one of David's mighty men? He's the guy that killed the lion in a pit on a snowy day. So I want him on my team. You know, this guy. And you'll see him take action tonight if we get to it. Then you have Nathan the prophet. Who was Nathan? You remember him? He was the one that told David the parable of the ewe lamb and had the guts to tell him, you are the man, regarding the affair with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. He's the only person bold enough to stand up to David. So Nathan was on Solomon's side. And you had, this is interesting, Shimei. I don't know if you remember the story about Shimei. He was the one that cursed David during the rebellion of Absalom, and then begged for his forgiveness when David was taking back the throne, and David showed mercy on him and didn't slay him. And Shimei, I'm thinking this is just a move for survival, really, because he's worried about crossing David in anything at this point. And then a few others are mentioned among David's mighty men. They were with Solomon. And Adonijah sensed this because he had this, I don't know if it was a celebration or a coronation, maybe even, later Nathan tells Bathsheba he's taken the throne. But in verses 9 and 10, you see that he goes outside of Jerusalem to this place called En Rogel. and invited all the brothers, the king's sons, all the royal officials of Judah. But he did not invite Nathan the prophet, or Benaiah, or the mighty men, or Solomon his brother. He knew what he was doing. He knew that Solomon was supposed to be on the throne. If all of this was above board, he would have invited all of those people. So they were left out because he knew he wasn't supposed to be doing this. So it's up to Nathan and Bathsheba to take action. This is really interesting to see Bathsheba in this role. Much older now than the woman that we read about in 2 Samuel chapter 11. But they decide to intervene on Solomon's behalf, Bathsheba first, then Nathan. And they were able to convince David. After all, David had said, Solomon's the man. So we can skip a lot of that back and forth and go on down to verse 30, where David tells Nathan and Bathsheba, "As I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, saying, Solomon your son shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne in my place. Even so will I do this day." So David's saying, in my dying breath, I'll make sure Solomon is the one that follows me on the throne in Jerusalem. So Adonijah's campaign ended as quickly as it began. He had this great big party. Solomon, his anointing was rather subdued. It was humble. It was characteristic of David more so than something Absalom would do, which again shows that Solomon was the one who had the character to continue the throne in Israel. So with Solomon in place, David's days are drawing to a close, and we have some final words from David. And this is the meat of the lesson here, is this wisdom from this old king who's been through so many battles and so many heartaches and so many triumphs. And there's wisdom here for all of us to learn from. So we're going to go through the words as we see them in 1 Kings 2 and also 1 Chronicles 28 and 29. And we'll just kind of patch them together because we get different details from the two different accounts. We're going to start in 1 Chronicles 28. I believe this chronologically is what comes first. He begins talking about the temple. Now you remember he wanted to build the temple, but God said, you had too much blood on your hands. Your son Solomon will build the temple. But David did everything he could to get up to the line that God drew in the sand about the temple. He said, I couldn't build it, but he didn't say David couldn't dream about it. He didn't say David couldn't plan for it. He didn't say David couldn't gather materials for it. He didn't say David couldn't inspire the nation to build this temple. And that's precisely what he's doing with his dying breath. If you look at 1 Chronicles 28, 2 and 3, the king David rose to his feet. So he's still strong enough to do that. And he said, hear me, my brothers and my people. I had it in my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord and for the footstool of our God. And I made preparations for building. But God said to me, you may not build a house for my name, for you are a man of war and have shed blood. Rather than bemoaning what he couldn't do, David is overflowing with gratitude over what he's been able to do, and that God has given him a son to carry on the legacy. So if you skip down to verse 6, he says, it is Solomon your son who shall build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father. He's speaking the words of God here. I will establish his kingdom, God says, forever if he continues strong in keeping my commandments and my rules as he is today. Now, therefore, in the sight of all Israel, the assembly of the Lord, and in the hearing of our God, observe and seek out all the commandments of the Lord your God, that you may possess this good land and leave it for an inheritance to your children after you forever. So he repeats God's words here that say, Solomon will follow you and proceed in the building of the temple. David was excited to his dying day about this project because of his love for God. Now, he speaks about godliness next, and this is still in 1 Chronicles 28. And he says three things to Solomon about godliness in verse 9. So he's been talking to the assembly, and it's as if he turns to Solomon and speaks to him one-on-one at this point. And the first thing he tells him is, know God. He says, "You, Solomon, my son, know the God of your father." He understands how the tyranny of the urgent can pull a leader away from what he needs to be focusing on. And he's saying, don't lose your focus. It's like he's putting a compass in Solomon's hand and directing him and saying, go in this direction. Know God. Understand the God that I followed and delivered me. Don't make the mistakes I made. Stay loyal to Him. Secondly, on godliness, he says, serve the Lord. So use the knowledge of God to take action for Him. Verse 9 continues, serve Him with a whole heart and with a willing mind, for the Lord searches all hearts and understands every plan and thought. So you hear the warning in there against just an external going through the motions. If you try to fake this, God is going to know it. And the same is true of us. If we're just serving Him to look good or to please somebody, God sees that. We may fool everybody else, but God sees that. He says, you need to serve Him with your whole heart. Put your whole being into it. Desire this service. Don't look at it as an obligation. Don't get drug into it kicking and screaming. Thirdly, on godliness, he says, seek the Lord. This is the rest of verse 9. If you seek Him, look at the conditional nature of that. If you seek Him, He will be found by you. But if you forsake Him, He will cast you off forever. God is not playing hide and seek. He's easy to find. If you seek Him, He will be found by you. But if you forsake Him, He will cast you off forever. So he laid this goal down. He says, don't drift about life aimlessly. You'll get nowhere that way. Seek the Lord with your kingdom. Good advice from father to son. Now, he returns to the temple in the next comments, and we won't go over all of these, but he gives him a little advice on the construction of the temple. Look at verse 10. Be careful now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house for the sanctuary. Be strong and do it. Get it done. And then verse 19, he says, all this He made clear to me in writing from the hand of the Lord, all the work to be done according to the plan. So the blueprints are from God, David says. I can just see him setting these blueprints down in front of Solomon and saying, I want to do it all, but this is all I can do. I'm handing it over to you. It's up to you, a man of peace, to build the temple of peace. Let's go back over to 1 Kings, because now I think we're chronologically meant to go over here and pick up some things from 1 Kings chapter 2. Verse 1 says, David's time to die drew near, and he commanded Solomon his son. So I read this as the same setting as 1 Chronicles 28. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But it's near the end of his life anyway. And the next thing he tells Solomon is, death is inevitable. He uses this expression, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. And there may be a lot couched in that. For example, David may be saying, I don't want you to be sad. This is a part of life. All of us go through this. I'm prepared for this. But there also may be a little wistfulness in that statement as he's telling Solomon, get busy about what needs to be done. Your time on earth is short. Everyone's time on earth is short. And so he talks about this appointment with death we all have. But he follows that with this advice. I don't know if you can say this these days, but he says, be a man. Be a man. I'm about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man. Now, he wasn't just talking about sex and gender here. He didn't say, show yourself a male. I mean, that's meaningless. He was telling him there's some characteristics that are masculine in nature that I want you to demonstrate. He mentions strength specifically here, but I think he's talking about leadership qualities. I think he's talking about bravery. He's talking about courage. Things we say today traditionally masculine. things we're losing our grip on, things we're afraid to talk about because of political correctness. There's nothing wrong with masculinity and femininity, except for maybe the way I say femininity. I'm not sure I'm saying that correctly, but there's nothing wrong with feminine characteristics and masculine characteristics. Those are ingrained in us. We're created with that. I realize there are differences from person to person, and individuals may be on a spectrum of masculinity, but there are things that there are roles for men and roles for women in society. There are things women do better than men and things that men do better than women. And I don't know how specific David is getting here, but it gives us a pause to look at this language and ask, well, David meant something when he said that. What did he mean when he said, show yourself a man, act like a man? What did Paul mean when he wrote 1 Corinthians 16:13? Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. What does it mean to act like men? You know, today, sadly, the first things that come to your mind when somebody says act like men may not be noble characteristics like fearlessness and bravery and courage and strength, but it may be the dad of the sitcoms that's fumbling about and never knows how to do anything and it's just the joke at the house. But he's saying, be a father to your nation. Be strong, be courageous, be someone that people can look up to and lead. And I believe that we still need that message today. The next thing he says as words of advice. By the way, does this sound like a senile old man to you? Sounds like he's got all his mental faculties, that he knows exactly what he's talking about.
Drew, you know, as we're approaching the end of life and so forth, we're not like David here, about to go the way of the earth and so forth. We are all emotional. David's not emotional about this, in the way I read this. He's very thoughtful, in control, and he's telling his son, I'm about to go to the end of life. And be strong. And we are sometimes just the opposite of his actions.
Yeah, you don't see any desperate clinging to the physical life that he knows is leaving him. He seems prepared. And I realize that we're not seeing, a full snapshot of everything that's going on, but what the inspired writers have recorded for us here is showing exactly what you're saying. Somebody who knows, has accepted, and is at peace with these things. Yeah. And, a lot of people believe that he was about 70 years old, which these days we don't look at as really old. We certainly don't think somebody is on their deathbed at 70 years of age. I think David put his body through a lot. And of course, he didn't have the modern medicine that we have today. Lifespans were shorter back then. But he seems prepared and ready for anything, which is the inevitable at this point. So the next thing he tells Solomon, keep the charge of the Lord. Verse 3, keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn, that the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. A lot of conditional statements there. Solomon, your success is going to depend on your willingness to keep the commandments of the Lord. And this is the part that Solomon really needed to tune into. Now it goes back to Deuteronomy. I want you to see how similar David's advice is to the law of Moses. Deuteronomy 17. A lot of people don't realize that in Deuteronomy, even though there was no monarchy established at this time, Moses anticipates the kings and talks about qualifications for them, should they have them. The Lord foresaw this and put it in His law. So there's several things here, but what I want to draw your attention to is the similarities between this piece of advice we're talking about here regarding the commandments of God and the laws in Deuteronomy 17, verses 18 and following. Of the king, the law says, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests. Do you realize how long it would take to hand copy down the law of Moses? That is some dedication. That's some real study. But the Lord wanted the king's hand on every letter of the law. And he was to do it himself. He wasn't to delegate it to his scribes. He is to write for himself. And then it had to be approved by the Levitical priests. No, you're not done yet. You hadn't got done with Numbers. You've got to finish. And some people say it was just the book of Deuteronomy. Maybe it was. But even if it was just that book, that's quite a feat for him to copy that down. It would take a lot of time. Verse 19, it shall be with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them. So he was to write out his own Bible, and he was to keep it for his whole reign. It was to be near him at all times, carry it around with him everywhere he went. And he was to do this, verse 20, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. The way we would say that is, so that he would know no one is above the law. He is not to be lifted up above his brothers. No one is above the law. David is telling Solomon, you're not going to be above the law. If you disobey God, you will not be successful. If you obey Him, He will make sure that you are a success. So you see these instructions David gives on his deathbed, so to speak. I actually don't think he was in bed when he was doing it. In 1 Chronicles, he stands up to give these instructions. But you see this advice, and the question is, did Solomon follow the advice? Well, the first thing that he does after David dies, or one of the first things that he does, is he makes an alliance with Egypt by marrying Pharaoh's daughter. And some people will look at that and say, already, we know the rest of the story here, already Solomon is marrying foreign wives, which was against the law of Moses. Well, not exactly. If you look at the laws, and I jotted them down here, Exodus 34, 11 through 16, Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. If you look at the law about intermarriage with foreign wives, it specifies the Canaanite nations, all the ites, the Hivites and the Ammonites and the Amorites and the Hittites. And then even Canaanite nations who were unbelievers. So it didn't say anything about Egypt. Still, it didn't seem that the spirit of the law was in Solomon's heart in making this move, especially so early in his reign, to go to Egypt. Egypt was the largest nation around, and everybody wanted to make an alliance with Egypt because, it's kind of like NATO today. Egypt, if we're in with Egypt, then we've got a lot of power behind us if anybody tries to mess with us. And so that makes us a little wary of Solomon. And another perplexing issue were the executions. So after David dies, there are several executions. His brother Adonijah, half-brother, but still, his own flesh, his own kin, who was a rival to the throne. He sent Benaiah, the mighty man of David, he sent him to kill Adonijah. Abiathar was one of Adonijah's supporters. He was a priest and he'd been loyal to David numerous times. So he didn't have him executed, but he exiled him to Anathoth, which is pretty interesting. Let me just say this little side note here. Anathoth was the home of Jeremiah centuries later. And a lot of people believe that the priestly line began with right here where Abiathar was exiled to Anathoth. And he set up his family there, moved his family there, and they had children through the generations. And Jeremiah was probably one of his descendants. We don't know that for sure, but it's a pretty strong possibility, considering what Anathoth was before Abiathar moved there. Out of respect for what he had done for his father, he did not execute him, but he was certainly exiled. Joab was put to death. Joab ran to the altar of burnt offerings in front of the tabernacle and held on to the horns. These altars had horns on all four corners, and the priest would apply the blood of the sacrificial animals to those horns. And he took hold of them because it was a way of seeking asylum. He thought might get him immunity. I don't know how long he thought he could stay there. But Solomon said, if that's where he wants to die, let him die there. He sent Benaiah in, and Benaiah struck him down right there as he held on to the horns of the altar. The reason was because he had shed so much innocent blood. Well, it's a little hard to understand because David had shed a lot of innocent blood. And Joab had shed a lot of innocent blood at the orders of David. But this was coming from David through Solomon, and there are other statements that suggest that this was God's will. Joab had murdered a lot of people. So despite the grace that was shown David, this was justice at the very least. David also asked Solomon to bring Shimei to justice. And when we studied Shimei, you remember David took an oath, I won't kill you. But he didn't say, I won't have my son kill you. So near the end of his life, he tells Solomon, I want you to take care of Shimei. And there's kind of a wink in there. He doesn't tell him exactly what to do, but Solomon knows, and he has him executed as well. In the case of Joab and Shimei, they didn't follow the law, and they were executed accordingly. For example, Exodus 22:28 says that no one should curse the Lord's anointed. Well, Shimei had done that, and so he was guilty. But again, we're led to wonder if Solomon's actions weren't fueled by vindictiveness and self-interest as well. But on the positive side of things, as a father, David had failed with Amnon, he had failed with Absalom. But his parting words here show love for Solomon that he didn't show his older children. Solomon was the son of most people would say, his favorite wife, Bathsheba. And he was a son in David's older years. And he seems to be trying to make up for some neglect that he had done to his other sons. Now, if we stop here with these last words in 1 Kings 2, we end with his instructions regarding Joab and Shimei. And his last words would be verse 9, bring his gray head down with blood to Sheol. And that's not really where I want to leave David. I'd really hate if that was his final words, and I don't think they were. Because if you go back to 1 Chronicles and you go to chapter 29, there's more. And this is the David we all know and love. And I believe he ended his life with these words of prayer. And so let's look at these. And in this prayer, this is, as you would expect from David, who wrote so many Psalms, a great model for us to follow. Let me suggest this. If you're struggling with your prayer life, maybe you feel like you've gotten into a routine, you just say the same things over and over again, or maybe you're really struggling with some things right now and you don't know what to say to God. These words could be something that you could repeat, or this outline that he uses is something you could follow and put your own words into. But he follows a simple outline of praise, thanksgiving, and intercession. The praise is in verses 10 through 12 of 1 Chronicles 29. David blessed the Lord in the presence of all the assembly, and he said, "Blessed are you, O Lord, the God of Israel, our Father, forever and ever. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty. For all that is in the heavens and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you are exalted as head above all. Both riches and honor come from you, and you rule over all. In your hand are power and might, and in your hand it is to make great and to give strength to all." David was a poet. He was really good with words. You don't have to pray this eloquently, but how often do you just take time to worship God in your prayer life? To talk about how He is overall, how glorious He is, how much you receive from Him, how He's in control of all things and no one is mightier than He. Try that. The second part of it is thanksgiving. I think we're better at this than the praise. Listen to David's thanksgiving, verses 14 through 16. "Who am I and what is my people that we should be able thus to offer willingly? All things come from you, and of your own have we given to you." This is a great verse on giving. When we start getting really stingy with our money, we need to remember that what God is asking us to do is just give Him what He's given us. It belongs to Him anyway. So of your own we have given you. That's what He says. "For we are strangers before you and sojourners, as all our fathers were. Our days on the earth are like a shadow, and there is no abiding. O Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided for building you a house for your holy name comes from your hand and is all your own." He ends the prayer with intercession. So he's praying on behalf of others. "O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, our fathers, keep forever such purposes and thoughts in the hearts of your people." He knows he's not going to be there with them. So keep this in their hearts, direct their hearts toward you. "Grant to Solomon my son a whole heart that he may keep your commandments, your testimonies, and your statutes, performing all, and that he may build the palace for which I made provision." Praise, thanksgiving, and intercession. Good outline to follow in your prayer life. I don't know how many days later we get to verse 28, maybe several days past, maybe weeks, perhaps a month or two. But it says that he died at a good age, full of days, riches, and honor, and Solomon his son reigned in his place. From that day forward, every king that followed on the throne was measured by David. It would say of a bad king, he did not walk in the ways of David his father. Or of a good king, he walked in the ways of the Lord like David. But David was the standard, the man after God's own heart. And that's why when Jesus came along, people were still looking over their shoulder for the next David. The son of David, the Messiah, would come. He would be a man of blood. He would be a military man. He will set up a strong nation. He will unify the physical nation of Israel together. The 12 tribes will all come back together. And all this anticipation was focused on that military vision of David, that they missed the true David who came in their midst, Jesus Christ, the ultimate Messiah, the Lord of David even. And Christians today look to Him. He is our King. He is the one we follow. He's the one David was looking for. He's the one that established David's throne forever. So I hope you've enjoyed looking at his life. I've enjoyed it very much. It's been instructive, but we fail to get the point if we don't end the class thinking of how David was nothing but an ancestor of the true King, Jesus Christ. Next week is singing night, correct? That's right, isn't it? I get this mixed up a lot, so I have to. And then we start the spring series in 2 weeks. So look forward to doing that. Thank you.